Hello, Masterclass participants. It's late on a Thursday night. I've just got off over 4 hours of Zoom parent-teacher interviews, but I'm committed to answering your questions, and there were a lot of them based upon the second webinar. Let's jump straight in. Page 1. Bernadine and Lee had two questions that were related. First was, are bulletproof definitions similar to learning intentions? And also, is how will I know, the question that I ask the teachers that I often work with, is that equivalent to success criteria? We're kind of on the right track here. So bulletproof definitions, I would say, are very similar to learning intentions. They're probably just a more specific way of outlining them. So whereas a learning intention is often in terms of a question, a bulletproof definition is more in terms of explicitly what we want the students to understand. So there's probably a bit more overlap between a bulletproof definition and a success criteria, actually. The how will I know, I would actually relate that probably, rather than to success criteria, I'd probably relate that more to checks for understanding and small, low-stakes assessments. Fiona West said, what about reading it to them, then having them read it back? I guess this is to do with introducing bulletproof definitions. I think that's great, and that's very in line with Hollingsworth and Ybarra's approach within explicit direct instruction to introducing learning intentions. So that would work perfectly well. The key thing is that this the bulletproof definition really acts as an anchor in the long-term memory of the student, and it's an anchor that we hope to set firmly in place and then enable the students to kind of build on top of it. So there's that anchor. So if for example, we think about the definition of cognitive load theory that I presented at the start of the presentation, cognitive load theory is a collection of instructional recommendations based upon the science of how humans learn. That is an anchor. And so we can build on instruction recommendations. Okay, well, that's reduce split attention, reduce transience, reduce redundancy, use worked examples, things like that. Each of them, which then builds off. And based upon the science of how humans learn, well, hopefully that's now anchored in your mind. And then you can break that down further into, okay, we've got the environment, working memory, long-term memory, things like that. So the crucial thing is to not stop at the bulletproof definition, but it's a fantastic place to start and a great summary. Page 2, Tanya asks, Anita Archer recommends choral reading to improve reading. Does it depend on whether the focus is fluency or gaining content? So I guess, yeah, I haven't looked heaps into the research on choral reading. I think there's probably a few different benefits to it. One would be that, well, this is an interesting one. As humans, we are predisposed to a lot of practices that kind of build a sense of tribe or a sense of community, and actually repeating things, singing things together, banging out rhythms and things like that together builds a sense of community. So choral reading actually builds a sense of community. If students are also working on fluency, I can also see how choral reading would potentially contribute to that as well. The issue with the kind of redundancy and written and seeing something and hearing it at the same time is that we have two channels, that phonological loop and that visuospatial sketchpad, that if the information is delivered via both those channels, they're going to be competing. But if students, for example, are the intrinsic task of the lesson is helping them to connect the written words on the page to the sounds they make, then reading together is going to be really helpful. Would you suggest we read it to students and then they read it to us, rather than them just tracking as we read? So one of the challenges and this is probably going to relate to the next couple of questions on this slide, which are all about this same redundancy to do with written and spoken text idea. One of the challenges we face as teachers is that the redundancy with written and spoken text relates to one specific student, right? So Megan in our class might be a really confident reader. So having it in written form and her hearing it at the same time is actually, redundant for her because she's very capable reader. Someone else in the class, Tanya, for example, might be struggling, not to have a go at you, Tanya, but someone else, for example, who is called Tanya, might be struggling with the reading side of things. And so actually just hearing it is very helpful for them. Another student might be hard of hearing, so the written text is not redundant at all. And another student, again, might have issues focusing, so just listening is a bit of a challenge for them, and therefore having it in a visual representation is helpful. So we've got to remember that the redundancy here is based upon the analysis of a single student, and when we kind of branch out or think about the whole class, it's a big challenge. When I present to an adult audience, it is a fair assumption for me that the audience can read, especially if we're at an education conference or a presentation or something like that. So I can assume that reading, and probably in the older year levels when my students are pretty confident readers, I can be pretty sure that reading out myself and having them read it is going to be redundant. But if I'm in a lecture theatre that's really large and there's people up the back who I don't think are going to be able to see, I'm still going to read my slides. And as in the masterclass, when I know some people are kind of listening while they're doing the dishes, driving their car, I'm still going to read it out. So it's good to have this knowledge, but understanding the mechanism behind it enables us to kind of tailor our instruction and modify things to the point or to fit our audience in the context. Christina asks, so what does it mean for things like using immersive reader to support students who are struggling readers? Again, I think probably would help with that fluency. And Natalie says, yes, how does that work for choral reading, partner readings, etc.? So some things that I've already handled there. And Matcha, hope I'm saying your name correctly there, probably not, I should Google that. I think choral reading, etc. is a kind of worked example, ? It could be. If fluency was that goal, the I do is maybe you reading, the we do is choral reading, and the you do is the independent reading. So I could see that's potentially a good argument there. Question 3, Tanya. So copying from the board is split attention. Yeah, I would suggest that it would be a form of split attention because you're looking up on the board, then you're looking down to your own notes, looking up to your board, looking down to your own notes, which is also why, learning to touch type, so you can look at something and touch type at the same time, is going to reduce that split attention for yourself. Or reporters have worked out shorthand that's reducing the split attention, presumably. Deb asks, reduced split attention, reduced transience seem to be at odds with one another. Where can I read more about the differences? Reduced split attention and reduced transience seem to be at odds with each other. I can't see that contradiction myself, unfortunately. Split attention, we meant information which must be combined should be placed together in space and time. Okay, yep. And transience, try to reduce, I don't know what my bulletproof definition is there. It doesn't rhyme, so it doesn't stick in my brain as well. Reduce transience, just make sure that students aren't holding info in working memory. I'm struggling, Deb. I'd love for you to follow up with that, and I'll reply in writing. Question 4, page 4. Would love the full summary. I will send that through. It'd be great to have a reference of all the stages referred to in the lecture. Thank you. Yeah, Ben, there were so many of them. I referred to so many. Really, the best place, I'm not trying to flog my book here, but really the best place is just the book, because I've included really meticulous referencing there for you. Same Aurora, and that cheat sheet, the cheat sheet about all the cognitive load things to check out. I'm still developing that in partnership with the founding members of the cognitive load theory mastery course. So that will be out in that course shortly on June the 1st. Mel, will daily maths reviews be an example of worked examples using a recite, recall, apply model where the teacher segments information in a well-sequenced order utilizing modality and reduced extraneous load? I think that's a great example of worked examples. We see worked examples in there. A key thing about the retrieval effect is that, and this is another phrase I've come up, this is, I was trying to be like Anita Archer and come up with something that's really memorable, but in terms of the retrieval practice, the harder the forage, the stronger the storage. The harder the forage, the stronger the storage. What that means is the harder a student has to search for a memory or an idea before they can retrieve it, if they are successful, and that's a key caveat, if they're successful, but if they're successful, that retrieval itself is going to give them a greater increase in storage strength than if it was easier to remember. Simple example of this is if I tell you the way to say, I don't know, something to think in Chinese. Think in Chinese is xiang. So now you repeat after me, 想, that means think in Chinese. And then I say, okay, tell me what think in Chinese is. You're probably going to be able to say something like 想 straight away, right? But me asking you straight after, when it's really easy for you to retrieve, that's not going to mean that you remember it long term. However, if I ask you tomorrow, and you can only just remember, but you can remember, the act of retrieval when it's harder is going to be more beneficial for you than doing so when it's easier. So there's kind of this tightrope to walk as a teacher. If we think students can retrieve, we should force them to retrieve, or give them ample opportunities to retrieve. Robert Bjork says, to fail to retrieve something when you can is to rob yourself of the opportunity of ingraining that memory more strongly. Uses that really powerful language, to rob yourself if you don't retrieve. So we don't want to rob our students of those opportunities to retrieve if they can retrieve information. But if they can't, then we do need to provide that input first. Cycling back to your question there, Mel, with the recite, recall, apply, if students are ready to go to recall already, go straight there. But again, we're dealing with multiple students in the class. Some will be able to recall straight away, some won't. And so probably starting with a recite is a good idea. And that does map the I do, we do, you do very well as well. Matya again, working memory and cognitive load. Do I think it right if I think that students with small working memory are cognitive overloaded? I'd probably make a slight change to that and say that it's true to say that students with a smaller working memory capacity are more likely to be overloaded in a scenario when a student with regular working memory capacities would not be. So yeah, 100% on the right track there, Matya. Really got to Google your name. Lynn, probably maybe from Lynn, maybe from someone else. This would be helpful for those students with language disorders where their phonological loop is reduced or impaired. I can't remember what this would be refers to, but I'm sure you're right, Lynn. Let me know, Lynn, what you were talking about. Your question answered, number 6. Anthony Chow says, Anthony's asked lots of great questions. Regarding the last point by Dylan William, would it suggest, and I assume that last quote was about Dylan Williams saying the main reason why he thinks cognitive load theory is the most important thing for teachers to know is because it shows us that even if students complete a task correctly, they may not have learned from it. So regarding the last point by Dylan William, would it suggest that developmental rubrics are ineffective as it is more focused on performance than deep learning? If so, what do you use for summative assessments? As you know, Melbourne Graduate School of Education really emphasises Goodman charts and developmental rubrics. Okay, well, first comment on that one is that Dylan William hates rubrics. So whatever Dylan Williams said is likely to contradict rubrics. But in terms of this one, I think it's more just an argument for development over time. So if basically Dylan was saying, if students perform, if they can do something in one specific scenario, and that, a simple example is we give students a worksheet, and at the end of the lesson, they hand you back the worksheet and has all correct answers on it, right? The point there is that doesn't mean that the student learnt it for many reasons. One is because they could have copied off their friends. 2 is because they could have just used analogical reasoning or some other approach where they've essentially been able to answer these specific questions based upon the great scaffolding you've provided, for example, but they're not able to answer future questions. Another one is they could have used trial and error, and this is the main idea of the goal-free effect. Or they may have used some procedure where the procedure itself took up so much cognitive capacity that they weren't able to actually realize the patterns in the procedure that are going to be sufficient to help them to use it in the future. So I'd more see it as developmental rubrics can still work in this case, but we just need to make sure we're revisiting them and not just assuming that an assessment at a single point in time it gives any sort of stable reflection or estimate of this, what the student's going to be able to do, say, make or write in the future. And that's kind of an assessment principle that can be applied more broadly as well. But really, we just want to make sure that if we do use a rubric, we're not assuming that, because they did that in term 1, they can still do it in term 2. I also think that we often overemphasize these developmental rubrics, like, you can map out skills and see if students can do them. And Dylan William, I really agree with him here. rubrics are often a very, very unhelpful scaffold for students if they're not supplemented by student work samples. So rubrics great, but you need to show students exactly what you mean when you say can write with originality and flair. You need to give students an exact example of what that looks like and the success criteria for that if you're going to use it. Otherwise, write with originality and flair means literally nothing to them. That's an example Daisy Christodoulo likes to use. Caroline Tudor. In visual learning, we are expected to present learning intention and success criteria. John Hattie, I guess, visual learning, I'm assuming. How does the goal-free effect fit with success criteria? Does it mean that there is a value in having learning intentions but not necessarily the success criteria? A few things. So one thing that I didn't have time to go into in our masterclass, and that's because we were just a bit short for time. Something that I went into more detail in the book, and I will go into even more detail with in the online course, is goal-free effect only works under very restricted conditions. And there's kind of three conditions. There's restricted actions. So the player, the student, should only be able to do a small number of actions. And by restricted actions, I mean, if they can do 2 or 3 things and then they can observe the effect of those 2 or 3 things, that's great. If not, they're probably going to be able to do too many things and not be able to track the impact. The second thing is, restricted actions. Reliable results is the third one. I'm struggling to remember the second one now. Reliable results. So whatever they do, the result has to be the same every time. Restricted actions and reliable results. So this is a great example of the harder the forage, the stronger the storage. Obviously, I haven't retrieved this enough times, but it's on the tip of my tongue. So I know that if I try hard to remember now and I retrieve it, it's going to embed this memory even stronger in my memory. So I'm going to keep going and you're going to watch me painfully try to remember this. Restricted actions and reliable results. I'll come back to it. But the point there is that there are a set of preconditions for the goal-free effect to be effective. You're watching me struggle here. And that's the key point. It doesn't always work. Does this mean there is a value to having learning intentions, but not necessarily the success criteria? I think it's often valuable to have both. I think it's more about the extent to which we share those learning intentions and success criteria with our students. So in the tank situation, we could have the goal that students learn the relationship between salinity, temperature, current, and whatever the last thing was, and the populations of the animals. But we might not necessarily say that to our students in the first place. Or actually, as the goal, our success criteria more concretely could be to get the animals to these types of populations. But maybe we don't want to mention that to students at the start because we actually do want them to focus on learning about the mechanisms. All right, your question answer 8. Georgina asks, earlier with reduced split attention, you had mentioned that oral and written presented together may result in split attention. Oral and written presented together results in split attention. Regarding transients, you mentioned writing the oral on the whiteboard for students to see. How do we manage the difference? Okay, so I think what we mean here is that oral and written presented together may result in redundancy, so not so much split attention. I reckon that's redundancy. Regarding transients, you mentioned writing oral on the whiteboard. Yes, great point. Something else I go into in the book, and I will go into in maybe even more detail in the course, is that we have to overcome this challenge. So I've actually got a comparison table in the book. You want to not present spoken and written at the same time because that's redundant, right? But we do want to give students some written record of what's happened. So what can be most helpful is if we, for example, if I'm talking about working memory and long-term memory, first I will just show up the image. You will have noticed a lot of my slides were animated, right? So I just show up the image to start off with and I talk about it. And after I've talked about it, I press the next button and the words come up. So that's the kind of record that overcomes the transience, and students can refer back to that. But in the time that I'm actually presenting it, they don't see the words. So there's not that battle between the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. And 9, where can we buy your book? Anywhere, any good or evil bookstore. No, not many bookstores do it, but Amazon's fine. But if you go to also ollielovell.com/book, you can even get a signed copy if you're in Australia. Happy to post that to you for $20. But yeah, literally lots of places online. Amazon's very easy. Katrina, will the course be related to K-6 content? Yes, 100%. I think a lot of the people I've been working with in the founding members group already are from primary, and so there's lots of examples coming from there. Christy, will this be a NESA accredited hours for the course? I just actually looked up NESA then, and yes, I will do my best to accredit it, and I'll let you know about that, Christy, when that comes through. Alison, same question. And don't forget your discount code, Masterclass 10. That discount code is valid until the end of the month when the masterclass finishes. It's valid till the final masterclass, whichever date that is. So if you'd like to use that code for 10% off, feel free to do so before then. Restricted actions. Maybe something about repeated. Thank you. I'm actually gonna pull it up for you because it was in the slides. I'm gonna give you a bit of a sneak peek into the slides, some of the slides that I wasn't able to present to you on the night because we were a little bit out of time. Let's have a look here. Part 2. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Restricted actions, rapid feedback, and reliable results. So restricted actions, not too much for students to do, because if there's too many options for students to explore, they'll find it hard to track back the route that they took to their solution, and their working memories will be overloaded and they'll struggle to learn from it. Rapid feedback means that the gap between when the student takes the action and when they see the outcome of their action within the goal-free effect is not too long, because if it's too long, they'll fail to see the connection between cause and effect. And reliable results means that every time they take the same action, they get the same results so that they can actually learn from the situation. And there's more examples about that in the book. It's detailed in more detail. Hopefully that was helpful for you. Hopefully you feel like your questions have answered. This is how long we've been talking for here, almost 20 minutes or something like that. So it's almost as long as the presentation itself or getting up there. But I was really keen to do my best to answer your questions. Hope that's been really helpful, and I hope you really, really enjoy the rest of the masterclasses. See you around.